We live. We live. We live. What's up, everyone? It's Manny Lloyd. Thank you to everybody here watching on Facebook and our YouTube. This is We Got the Jazz, a jazzy hip hop Black Friday, our final Black Friday of the year. Very excited for you all to check out what we have got going on today. We're gonna later on about 1:30, Big B's gonna hop on our Instagram and give us some jazz hip hop tunes. So if you want some good vibes for studying, or maybe you're on a drive, or just want to enjoy this nice Friday, I think it's supposed to get up to 71, so it should be nice outside, and so socially distance outside. But we are going to start. I'm very excited with the discussion. It's called A Reminder of Bebop, Jazz, and the Influence on Hip Hop, and we have a stacked group with me today, and I'm going to bring them on, let them introduce themselves. So first we have Dr. Theddy Burgh. Theddy, introduce yourself.
I'm Theddy Burgh, chair of philosophy and religion right now, a professor that tries to do a few things. I deal primarily with the ancient world, with archaeology, a little bit of religion, and try to play some music here, and we'll try to contribute to the conversation the best I can.
See, now he's being real. This man has literally written a book called "Is God Funkier World?" Dr. Burgh is also an ethnomusicologist, so don't let this modest act fool y'all. He when we were putting this together, I was like, I need Dr. Burgh, because I don't know. I mean, I listen to music, but he knows music. So very excited to have Dr. Burgh on. And down on you might be on right corner, we have Dr. Porco, our aficionado on hip hop. How you doing, Dr. Porco?
I'm doing well. How you doing? I'm Dr. Porco in the English department, where I'm an associate professor, and I'm mostly I teach some hip hop stuff and write about it, and just 20th century weird fun stuff of the avant-garde, of which hip hop is in a weird way. So yeah.
Everybody on here, Dr. Porco teaches the hip hop class. Like every semester, folks are like, "Oh, where's the hip hop class? I need to take the hip hop class." So this is hip hop, like braggadocious. Like, come on.
It is.
And then
here, thank you.
And then we have our fearless leader, Reverend Dr. Brother, the man with the plan, the king of Black people.
Director Sean Palmer. I'm good.
Director Sean Palmer, whose background is Africana studies, particularly hip hop. So, and he's also a jazz. I say a knowledgeable jazz fan. So, Sean, how are we doing today?
I'm doing well, and I'm excited to be here with Brother Burgh, who I get to consider not just a colleague in Africana studies, but also a colleague around, who's a brother in the greatest fraternity known to mankind, the Alpha Phi Alpha Fraternity Incorporated. So we get to do that. I don't know what Alex Porco is holding up for. I don't know why he waiting. You already know, sir. But I have found Brother Porco's mind to be like just a super brilliant person. And I'm always driving students to his hip hop class because I really want to teach hip hop, but like when I realized how well Alex teaches the class, I was just like, yeah, I need to, just let Brother Porco teach it, and you just kind of be a generalist. So while you have been away, Brother Porco, I have been teaching elements of hip hop in the Intro to Africana Studies class. We're actually going to end with trap music. We're ending with the biography of Gucci Mane as our final project for the class next week. So yeah, we in there. I'm on your team.
That all sounds amazing, and you have an open door in my class whenever you want to come.
Look.
You can.
I'm gonna show up to your class, and every semester without fail, I don't show up.
But yeah, I'm very glad to have everyone on. As you know, or hopefully you know, we've been doing it for a little bit, but Upperman's year is called "And It Don't Stop," which is looking at hip hop and specifically the golden age of hip hop. And it's perfect that we are kind of ending talking about jazz influences. I knew we couldn't go through this year without talking about one of my favorite groups and one of the most influential groups, A Tribe Called Quest, which is where We Got the Jazz comes from. And we know that jazz has had a musical, but also a social kind of influence on the development of hip hop. So we're kind of going to get into all that and a few other questions and just have a good conversation. We're going to start out with Professor Porco, who's going to tell us a little bit about the impact of A Tribe Called Quest and the low-end theory on hip hop. And what he informed me when we hopped on is that this is actually the birthday of Phife Dawg, legendary member of Tribe Called Quest. So, Dr. Porco, you want to kind of start the conversation from here?
Sure. I love A Tribe Called Quest. I'm proudly wearing my Low End Theory shirt down here. But just a little context before that album comes out, right? I always like to emphasize that. So the jazz hip hop thing is like a really late phenomenon, kind of, right? It's not like circa 1973 people are sampling jazz records. They're just not. I mean, I mean, if you just go post 79 through about 87, the sounds of the records just don't bear that out. It's primarily disco, new wave, and then like terrible kind of arena rock kind of stuff that gets readapted. But that is what the sound is until about 87, 88. And there's a couple important records that come out, right? It's the Guru, the Gangstar, Words I Manifest, that has the Charlie Parker version of A Night in Tunisia that gets sampled by DJ Premier, and then Stetsasonics talking all that jazz. And then that year, there's this really curious thing that happens in Spin magazine, so Spin has this, it's kind of strange to think about now, but they have this thing where it's like a series of articles in the October issue where it's like how to listen to rap, it's trying to teach people how to listen to rap music and like it, essentially, right? So they have all these little articles, but one of them is a conversation between Fab Five Freddy and Max Roach. And it's called Hip Hop Bebop, or Bebop Hip Hop. And it's really interesting because they're using it as this way of like, if we can get these two talking. And so, I mean, Fab Five Freddy's father knew Max Roach from like back in the day. So he was always in that house when he was a kid. So he'd known him his whole life kind of thing. But they do this really interesting interview where, so they map out these correspondences between hip hop and bebop in particular. And it's great. But it ends with everything kind of collapses at the end because the interviewer asks Max Roach about like, well, what do you think about the way it's really cool that like a hip hop DJ or producer can sample something like Led Zeppelin and kind of make it swing when it never did in the first place? And Max Roach kind of loses his mind, and Fab Five Freddy sides with the interviewer, and he's like, no. What the interviewer is saying is right. Like a DJ can make something far better. And apparently Max Roach kicks the interviewer out of his apartment. And so there's this whole there's this generational divide over like, so because Roach wants to see it like as this sort of single continuum from sort of from the 50s through 70s into hip hop. And whereas Fab Five Freddy has this more kind of like I don't know how you would say, like, he's like, well, there's also all these other kinds of music that I love. Like Fab Five Freddy was really great friends with the members of Blondie. And so he always introduced that kind of stuff into the music. And so there's this weird tension between it's either a complete smooth continuum or it's this more diversified sort of musical continuum of just what people were listening to in the early 70s kind of thing when they were sort of first sort of DJing and stuff. So I just find that 1987, 88 moment super interesting for that. And then the other weird thing is like this 87 and 88, when these records are being made, and that interview happens, it's the first moment where it's where the Jazz at the Lincoln Center stuff starts. So as jazz is about to be sort of, I mean, Wynton Marsalis does this classical jazz series, which is a weird phrase, right? Because they're trying to get it at the Lincoln Center. But at precisely the moment they're doing that is precisely the moment where there's this push to make hip hop or rap jazz. Right. And there's this weird cultural value thing happening, right? Because, well, for lots of reasons, right? This desire to sort of make something classical or value judgment stuff. Yeah. So it's just a really, really weird kind of moment in the history of hip hop. But that's all the context for A Tribe Called Quest. And the reason I bring that up is so when the low end theory comes out, right? there's lots of, I mean, that album has lots of legacies, right? So from the sort of Afrocentric stuff that gets through the lyrics, the first album of the native tongue stuff that actually goes sort of nationwide. I mean, they existed, but it actually popularizes that. The arrival of like Busta Rhymes, because he performs on the Arsenio Hall show, and literally the apocryphal story is the morning after the show that he gets a record contract. Like that's the story so it has lots of legacies, right? But the one I find most interesting is all the jazz samples, right? That album has, so I have this list here whipped up, right? So it's like Miles Davis, Eric Dolphy, Art Blakey, Weather Report, Grant Green, Cannonball Adderley, like you can go on and on. But the interesting part is Ali, the producer, right, who worked with Q-Tip on creating that sound on that album, by 1992, he admits, he's like, it's pretty much done. And he's saying that as someone who created the thing. And about 2 years after, so they're making it in 90. And by 92, I can give you the quote later, but he basically says, it's pretty much widely accepted and disseminated, and it's pretty much done. And he's sort of right, because like a year later is when you get Diggable Planets and Us Three, and you get all of a sudden Grammys going to those tracks, right? If you look at the early Grammy Awards and the awards they give them to for rap performances of groups, is Diggable Planets, Quincy Jones's rap album, Arrested Development. There's this really interesting thing happens about what sounds they want to give or award the rap performance stuff at the Grammys to. So, I mean, to me, the Cool Like That and the Us Three Cantaloupe thing are pretty much the end of. Doesn't mean it goes away. Like Guru does all his Jazz Mataz albums, and like I just earlier in this year, right? And I'll end here, but like Archie Shepp and his nephew and a friend of his nephew put out an album earlier this year it's pretty amazing. Like, I mean, it hasn't gotten a lot of notice because it's mostly on Bandcamp, and it just hasn't. Also, you know, with quarantine and stuff, but I mean, people are still doing interesting things with jazz rap. It's just, I think by like 95, 96, its moment has gone, right? It's clearly, it's like auto-tune in a weird way, right? There's a moment and I mean, it's just, you know, and then it's gone.
The problem with auto-tune is it doesn't seem to be leaving. It has not reached its peak. I keep thinking it has reached its peak. And then it continues to stay with us, Dr. Porco. I don't know how you feel about that. You know, just thinking about what you're saying, I also, as I was talking to my class, find that like the one challenge with jazz sampling is not that it's just you get this very generational critique from really kind of silent gen but early baby boomers, right? Who are like being proprietary about their musical tradition, which I think you point out very eloquently. But you also get this moment in hip hop because the technology is so quasi like subverted and advanced at the same time that no one knows how to handle the sampling. Like they don't know how to legally handle the sampling. And there's this weird moment right at the, like when you see, like I would argue that 2 Live Crew, so down in Miami-based territory, down in Florida, where you get the kind of this explicit version of hip hop that really takes its kind of walking steps from the blues tradition, and that actually typifies like this American discourse about how Black music and Black hip hop in general needs to have like some boundaries. Like it's the first level of like surveillance that we see kind of and censorship in music, which then leads to all of these like trademark infringement, which makes it difficult to actually sample and to sample multiple things on a track where you don't have a lot of music to work from. So I'm almost wondering if our legal system actually pushes us into the legacy of auto-tunes and like the drum beat, you know, kind of our technology currently in terms of trap music, but we can get there later.
That's a whole nother conversation that you teed up there, Sean.
I mean, this is what I'm thinking about this with Porco. Like I'm thinking I want I'm thinking about like how jazz shows up today, because I would say that most young African Americans, because as we know, music programs have been pulled out of schools, right? So we got a No Child Left Behind era that gave us dry schools that really had horrible retention rates, which don't expose students to like Miles Davis, or Mary Lou Williams, or any of those kinds of amazing artists. I mean, Duke Ellington is one of my favorites, but like you don't get, like, because young people think that their music is forming ex nihilo, like it is, like they're creating music out of nothing, and they don't see that there has a historical framework behind it. What you end up with is like an era of music that almost sometimes lacks the same kind of musicality that it might have had in inception, or definitely in what I might call the golden age of hip hop. But I know AP gonna say something about that.
I mean, I would just say like it changes. I don't want to say that people making hip hop are ahistorical. Because I sort of think like as time changes, the soundscapes change, and like I don't think necessarily like so one of the funny things about like the hip hop bebop thing is like the reality is like if you actually get to like the nitty gritty of it, like it's very rarely that bebop records are being sampled. What they actually mean is like this late 60s, early 70s kind of jazz stuff that's being sampled. And so so there's these weird things that happen where I mean I think people use the term jazz broadly, and then they say there's this connection in the same way that people say like all hip hop uses jazz. It's like sort of, but like so I'm from Canada. Like I know lots of indigenous hip hop that doesn't use jazz but uses its own traditions of sort of sampling of indigenous musics, right? So I'm not convinced like one has to sort of I mean, I'm a historical person by nature, but I don't want to compel some artists to have the same sort of notion as I do about it. Yeah.
And I would agree with you. I don't know if we could. I mean, at least in my arguments, I would say that the East Coast gave us jazz influenced hip hop in the same way that the West Coast gave us funk influenced hip hop. In the way that I would argue that the South gave us kind of like additional sounds like marching bands and blues, and honestly gospel, right? We see gospel actually show up in hip hop as well. So it's just, but okay, I don't want to monopolize the time with the folk who we brought. So Theddy.
No, but you're hitting on some stuff, but I do have some concerns of making sure that those genres are not lost. Those early pioneers. I mean, Parker, Gillespie, and those guys from, especially the heavy hitters from bebop, that they're just not glossed over because they don't learn about them. I think we do a disservice to people by not introducing them. You hit a big point where stuff has been taken out of school, and they don't get a chance to be exposed to this other than maybe a drive-by on, in February. But to really see how influential some of this stuff is, and who these pioneers were, I think it's extremely important. That's part of my mission. I mean, I teach private lessons, so when I'm teaching private lessons, I'm always sliding in how this music you like here, this is what happened, or you talk about the saxophone. Have you ever heard of this guy? And a lot of them are shocked. And I don't want to truncate the creativity of folk. Let's say if they haven't been exposed to bebop, that they hear Charlie Parker, Moody's Mood, whatever, and they create something that we haven't yet heard yet. Because I think if we don't, it's going to be sterile after a while. I mean, I dig a lot of stuff now, but after a while, and maybe it's just my old ears, it starts to sound the same. And I would love to see a generation come up with something that I just had no clue about, but at the same time still connect with those prophets from before. Because if it was not for them, a lot of this stuff wouldn't exist. So yes, I got some concerns there. I got to figure out how to address it. But yeah, definitely.
Yeah, kind of on that point, Dr. Burgh. Like as an ethnomusicologist, are there any similarities that you see between jazz or any specific types of jazz and hip hop, or even perhaps is there a reason why jazz has been was an influence for those groups when they kind of brought it into the forefront?
Yeah, in particular with that, there's a album. You guys familiar with Marcus Miller, bass player? Okay, all right. Marcus Miller did this album. As you tell, I've been around, album or CD in the late '90s. I think it was called Tales, and he actually has a track that talks about bebop and hip hop, and a nice little cut because Q-Tip speaks on there and a couple of others. And I think he interviews Joe Sample and different people, these little sound bites. But one of the things I see with that is bebop. You know, it came out of this. It's a rebellious music in some ways, because before that, you know, people were swinging. I mean, it was like, you know, it was swinging, it was dancing, all this stuff. And these guys were like, we're tired of being, you know, the little shine people that are entertaining you. I'm sick of entertaining you. So they started playing this intricate stuff, and people didn't like it, but they were playing for themselves and for other musicians and showing off this, you know, virtuosity, and it took off. And I see a little bit of that with hip hop, where, you know, these people are, I mean, you had R&B and so forth, but you got these guys that are, you know, doing these sometimes it's simple, but still, it was just to put this together, especially off the dome. That is one of the biggest things with bebop. You know, you got the introduce your melody, but then after that, these people take these songs to the stratosphere as far as creating on the spot, and, you know, seeing people. Did I freeze or anything? Guys, my internet is acting crazy. When I see these guys go to the cipher, you know, and they spit immediately, it's just everything is off the dome. I see that as one of the biggest correlations between jazz in general, bebop in particular, and hip hop and rap. That these guys are able to create on the spot, and a number of people that I've dealt with in the academic world that really don't have a huge connection to either type of music, they will dismiss it. And they do not understand the talent and skill that it takes to be able to create, you know, to someone give you a chord and off you go, or somebody give you a subject matter and off you go, and you create right there. You know, sometimes I think the respect is lost with that. So I see those as commonalities or universals in those two genres that aren't always present in others. And yeah, so that's to address your question a little bit there, man. You could go on and on with that, but
that virtuosity you're saying.
I would even add to just the language, the style of dress, because like the bebop guys, jazz guys, I mean, you'll see, I get all the time, man, you play jazz, right? How do you know? And they'll look at how I dress, which I don't really pay that much attention to. But if you go back and you look at, they had the zoot suits, they had, I mean, you see Miles was dressed to the nines, man. You know, there's a certain style. Also the language, you know, different things that are said, different words. So, you know, I'm talking to my friends and you'll hear me say, yeah, those cats are crazy. And people are like, what are you talking about, cats? That's just part of the lingo. Or, you know, with hip hop, the Izzo language, man, you know, when, you know, for shizzle, I mean, I would never say that, but I get where they're coming from, you know, and it's just out of these things come these languages that permeate and help generate more of our culture, you know, which I think is extremely important. Yes, style, language. It's just, I think from jazz and from hip hop with the whole thing, which is, you know, resurgence of another word, the swag. Bottom line, swag comes out of both jazz and I would say hip hop, different styles, but still, you know, it's produced there.
Yeah, sure. So Mr. Palmer. The golden age, I know Dr. Porco, with the golden age, it's like,
I'm for it. That's just a complicated.
So I'll circle back to that.
It's also my Gen X snobbery. That's just know that it's just my Gen X.
In the 90s, you know, not this influence of jazz, but also Afrocentricity, particularly in like tribes, in music, in De La Soul, you get wearing, you know, not wearing chains, wearing like more definitely very Afrocentric.
And yeah, the use of So there is this beautiful kind of tapestry emerging in hip hop, which I do think is why you end up. I have always argued that what hip hop ends up being kind of in mainstream circles is an amalgamation of the different branches that it was once, right? So like I would argue like what we hear in our head, even how we arrive to trap music, it emerges out of these ultimate critiques, right? And I do think the party is a critique, right? That there is still joy in these hoods, in these abandoned spaces that are based out of redlining and like crack and gangs and gun violence. I mean, and when I talk about that, like we got to talk about the influence of COINTELPRO on the Black Power movement and the use of what we call it, you know, what you would call if you were selling drugs, boy and girl, both being permeated in these communities, which means heroin and cocaine, right? Boy being heroin and cocaine being girl, right? And then how that gets picked up as crack. And then also HIV, right? Like these are communities that are hemorrhaging in poverty. And there is joy, which is why you get hip hop that gives you dance and joy and all of that. Then you get hip hop that actually seeks to think about what it means to have an underbelly, or what does it mean to be left disenfranchised. So you get that. Then you get another set of hip hop that is related. It's been popularized as gangster rap, but I cannot tell you that like coming up in the age of NWA or Ghetto Boys that I would have called it gangster rap. That was what white people called it, right? They're like gangsta, right? So, and I was like, but like, it was the story of living in these Black communities that were impoverished, and you either work at McDonald's or you sell crack, or you sell something that is what we might call an alternate economic reality. And I think you can see that emergence. I think we see those emergences as well. I also think that one of the reasons that you get Afrocentricity showing up in hip hop has a lot to do with that it is right on the end of an era of like African American inclusion in higher education and integrationist spaces. And all of these integrationist spaces are Eurocentric, right? Like they are pointing out European, like it's almost like a redesign of the normal school environment of the early 1900s and the Reconstruction era, which is like Black people have been left in their own kind of silos. And now because we realize maybe that's not the right thing to do, we bring them in to our spaces, but those spaces are ultimately very European, right? And they do not reflect these Black kids in inner cities, in poverty, or rural kids, or like they just don't reflect that. And so if you imagine that you get African American studies starting in 68, your earliest Black cultural centers in the late 60s as well, 1970, and then like this inclusion of like this robust redesign of like Black collegiate spaces that really put together Malana Karenga's Afrocentricity and the uniquenesses of like Hawida theory, which gives us Kwanzaa, right? You then ultimately have these very kind of ivory tower philosophical traditions that are also happening right at the same time as James Cone is producing Black liberation theology in the church, which is asking people to walk away from stuff. Then you also got the first natural hair movement with Black Power and Afros. All of that is coming into the 80s, right? Along with disco, along with these other things. And so what happens is they merge right at the start or right in the middle of a conversation around apartheid at historically Black colleges. And I think there's a solid argument to be made because Black students who are coming from all around the world to these HBCU spaces, who are bringing with them the hip hop of their region to those spaces, and who are being influenced by the hip hop of their era, are also not just connoisseurs of it, but they're also interpreters of it, right? And one of the ways that hip hop gets interpreted is really by Spike Lee, who then produces a set of movies that really kind of chronicle, like whether you're talking Malcolm X or you go back to School Days, like they're pushing these norms of blackness as like of Afrocentricity and blackness. It's the reason why you don't join Greek life at the time, or you join Kemet, or like, you know, like a Groove Phi Groove, which is an Afrocentric fraternity, because these other things are bourgeois sellout types of things, right? And so it's right at the same time, like hip hop emerges with an Afrocentric critique. Just as African-American Afrocentricity is becoming to be like a theory that really upsets kind of modernity and really pushes us into post-modernity, because what it says is Eurocentricity is not a truth. It's not the only truth, right? And so again, like I do think that hip-hop emerges, like we often think of hip-hop as being kind of anti-intellectual or anti-education. But I do think hip hop picks up on that, right? It might see it from a street idiom, it might see it from a folk idiom, but ultimately hip hop really interprets that sound, that the moment of Malcolm X or a reemergence of Malcolm X for a different generation, right? Or the reemergence of the Black Panther Party for the 1990s, right? The reemergence of this level of iconography. And then says, all right, well, let me talk to you about it in You Must Learn. Let me talk to you about it in Fear of a Black Planet. Let me talk to you about it in 911 is a Joke. Let me talk to you about it in The Stakes is High, which is actually a little later. Like Stakes is High is actually a little later. But so I do think that one of the things that we have to imagine, which is kind of using a Skip Gates framework, is that like, everything in Black culture is sitting on the porch talking to each other. So like these are speakerly texts. So Black students are talking to the culture, Black educators are talking to the culture in weird ways. Also, we have to talk about the influence of the Nation of Islam, right? The NOI as a major critiquer of like Eurocentric spaces, and that gets picked up in hip hop, which is why some people have argued that hip hop that you don't have hip hop. There's no such thing as Christian hip hop. Like there's no such. They would be like, nah. Their early folk would be like, I don't know what that is, but that ain't hip hop. So again, I do think that there's a really nuanced conversation to have about how cultural idioms speak back and forth, and I think that's one of the things that emerges. Also, you know, again, like I would argue that jazz is the music of Renaissance. Jazz is the music of kind of like as Porco was talking about, like how it gets elevated in the 80s or the late 80s and the early 90s into like America's music, right? It's different than when it was. You know, the term jazz, I think, means sex, actually. Like originally it means sex, right? So again, like our sexual prowess at bare minimum. So again, like seeing this music get elevated also is a part of the whitenizing of the music as well. It's when we see Black musicians, Black folk walk away from the music and go into other areas. And so like there are these nuances that are also happening at the same time as the music is being picked up and used, but also in I would argue that the sampling is also like a discovery / memory, like a Sankofa moment. Like it's a Sankofa. It's an intentional use of the theoretical principle of Sankofa as a way to remind us that this is our shit. And then I think on some level, like the use of Afrocentricity in hip hop, at least in that moment, is really kind of a way of dealing with folk coming of age in trying to make sense of systems.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you mentioned, which is great. I appreciate what you're saying. And make sure I understand. Would you call the development of hip hop at that time? You said anti-intellectual.
Well, that's how it's seen. Like everybody goes, it's anti-intellectual, it's hyper masculine, it's sexualized. It is. I mean, that's a part of the argument of the censorship, right? Like that it's out of hand. No one can understand it. You know, when you hear older folk, black folk talk about it, it's like, that's that rap tap stuff. It don't make no sense, right? And then like, so again, like that, you got folk, I can't remember the sister's name who passed, she passed a couple years back, Dolores, but like.
Dolores Tucker.
Yes, Dolores Tucker. So Dolores Tucker is this like she will not get off the jock of hip hop in terms of, and hip hop has so many genres, right? There was not one form of hip hop, I would say, in 1989. I mean, not so much that we had to go, this is underground and this is above ground, right? It was all kind of underground. It was all kind of, location based. It was all, and there were ways in which hip hop was deeply connected to the historical moment, right? I think I learned about police brutality through hip hop, right? Mm-hmm. I knew not to trust the Klan, but Southerners didn't get to hip hop till late in the game. They weren't late. We were just imitating New York and LA, right? So you like when you look at Miami bass is different. So like Miami is that's a whole different sound. But like I think what Regina Bradley would say is like when you get to like Dungeon Family in Atlanta, or Master P in New Orleans, and bounce music in New Orleans, or Miami bass music, they give you a different understanding, and they were not seen as the main. They weren't Salt and Pepper. They weren't Yo-Yo. They were not like, this wasn't MC Hammer or Will, or DJ Jazzy Jeff and the Fresh Prince. Like that was not the sound, right? Those sounds emerge and they take over later. But again, like you hear in the main these spaces telling us different stories that are influenced by the spaces where Afrocentricity is emerging. And both on the East and West Coast, you have that. You have these major intellectuals speaking. And I mean, even when I listen to Sister Souljah and go back to like Donahue interviewing Sister Souljah, there is so much of what she has to say in 1988 that sounds very much like what we hear in BLM, right? Mm-hmm. It's like the intellectual nature of hip hop was always present. It was just not a part of, it was not a part of the propaganda to constrict hip hop. Does that make sense?
Yeah, okay, I got it. Yeah, because I mean, I was gonna say I learned a lot, from hip hop. From, you said police brutality and the challenge of Elvis Presley. He wasn't shit to me. That type of stuff. And it challenged me. I was like, wait a minute, I got to regroup my stuff here. And some of this, this is coming from my nieces and nephews. Uncle Theddy, have you heard this? And it's like, oh my gosh, So that's why I was asking about the anti-intellectualism, because if anything, it was. I think it challenged what education was about, and that whole Eurocentric thing of like you learn this, and this. It's like, what about all this other stuff? You're talking Mansa Musa and all these these types of things. It's like, okay, yeah. So I appreciate that.
Well, no, because it's like I remember like you'd be watching. You watch some of the videos of like You Must Learn, and they're talking about the Caucasoid Mountains and stuff like that, or like even though we make fun of Flavor Flav now, but this whole notion of this clock, which reminds us what time is it, right? And like is this nation time, or like and it's on the heels of School Day saying wake up. Like those are iconic moments for much of Black young America at those times, right? And I do think that because, and I wonder if this is true for Bebop. If you are used to a certain pace, a sped up pace makes it difficult for you to listen in.
I think so.
Here's my argument. Here's my homiletical argument. There is a thought that preachers who are under 50 preach at a faster pace than older preachers because of the sound of hip hop that they've been listening to. Mm-hmm. So they preach faster beats per minute, which means that a preacher who might be under 30 has a faster pace. They've actually, I can't remember what study did this recently, but this was a few years back. And I was like, so when I would be sitting in class with my classmates and I would preach, one of the constrictions or one of the things that people would say often was like, you preach too fast. And so I'm like, it wasn't until I saw the data that I realized that my preaching is influenced by my use of hip hop music. So, and as a griot, I probably preach at the same tempo of the people I'm listening to who are in the culture. So I imagine that could be true for professors who at a certain age. That could be true for politicians at a certain age, spoken word poets at a certain age, right? So again, there are so many profound influences of the music, jazz, which turns into bebop, right? Or moving towards bebop, but also how hip hop also has gotten progressively faster as an intentional kind of part of who it's supposed to be, right? So,
I see. This is a great discussion. I still have a couple more questions, but we also have a question from some folks tuning in to Shira, who's actually our BSU freshman rep. So shout out to BSU. She asked, would you say that white music, and this is a question for everyone, would you say that white music industry owners have changed the meaning of hip hop or jazz when signing a Black artist to record deals?
You mean as an industrial complex?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think we should see the music industry as a music industrial complex in the same way we see prison industrial complex. And I'm sure Alex can tell you which musicians have said this out loud, but even Tribe has said they didn't pay us what we were worth, right? But there are lots of artists who talk about the horrible deals they got coming through the door.
Yeah, and I would say if you're looking at, there's lots of ways to think about music from 87, 88, 89, and 90. But if you look at the low end theory, one of its major themes is there are these tracks and verses that are talking about business industry practices. The business industry becomes a subject of rap lyrics as it becomes the business industry, right? So there's this kind of meta moment that happens in the late 80s so that's definitely happening. And to the larger point, I'd say and this ties into your comment, John, earlier about the importance of parties, the party, right? So those early records are made in a kind of party vibe in the sense of they just transplant live events into a studio, these kind of improvised, low-key, independent studios, Enjoy Records, Sugar Hill, all that. Sugar Hill was they had the house band, right? Positive Force. Doug Wimbish was on bass well before he joined Living Color and stuff. There are these great, and there's even in Detroit, Newtroit Records that Spider D put out in 1980, and he puts out Roller Skate Rap, and it's not a great song, but he's the first rapper to own his own label essentially. So there's all these independent labels, but by 84, right, Columbia purchases, or into 85, Columbia purchases Def Jam, and that pretty much initiates a major shift in production, so that the golden age for all its great, valuable things is precisely the moment where hip hop gets deracinated from its sort of local situation. And it's not by accident, I think, that it's precisely at the moment when that happens that you get tracks that are dealing with the record industry, but also tracks where, so to me, it's super important that Gangstar's Words I Manifest, which does this kind of, and then Jazz Thing, which then gets used on the Mo Better Blues soundtrack, right? Do these histories of, here's a history of Black music, right? It's not an accident that happens at precisely the exact moment that Boogie Down Productions does the history of hip hop in South Bronx, right? That there's this, it's at the exact moment when there's a fear of it being uprooted and deracinated, that there's an emergence from rappers to say, hang on one second, in my lyrics, let me explain, before this goes completely uprooted, let me reroute it for a second, right? I don't think that's by chance that happens. That's a response directly to the question of white large media conglomerates essentially at this point, right? I don't think that's by accident that those two things converge. So
yeah, that's a good point, Dr. Porco. And then I think something a couple of minutes ago I wanted to point out was when you were talking about the first records that get Grammys are these more like Diggle Planets, like more jazz influence around the same time that jazz is being elevated as almost, oh, and now it's actually American or white is what is being said. That's like, well, now that hip hop is more aligning with this kind of white, what we have now taken as more white and mainstream. Now we can start allowing you into access of of awards and all that. So I just think that was as you and Sean kind of like were talking, I was kind of making those connections.
I mean, it's like I get that the songs like it's a hard thing for me because I like a lot of the songs, right? I mean, I love them. But like it's a weird thing to think back and know that for a large, I mean, I would have been whatever. I would have been like 9 or so. I have a different relationship. But apparently, if you look at sort of the news media and stuff from the period, right? If you were 24 and white, and apparently, it gave you some kind of comfort if a rap song had a guitar on it, right? Like, I don't get that because I wasn't that old. You know what I mean? I was just growing up, but apparently that was a thing.
Well, and the other thing is, I think on some level you saw like Run DMC partner with rock and roll artists early, with Walk This Way and some of the other things. So like you saw these two industries that were supposed to be about the rebellion of youth cultures merge together. And I do think that's probably one of the reasons you see this kind of hybrid thing happening. So, and it's happened over and over again.
One thing too, I'd say, sorry, just as a thing about the jazz thing as well, is like one of the things that's bothered me always, and still does about that period from like 88 to like 94, 95, is that there was this weird assumption that if you were on the jazz aesthetic side of the hip hop stuff, that you were more conscientious, right? I don't know that actually plays out when you listen back lyrically, and also it discredits a whole kind. So like I know that De La Soul's members can say that the Chronic's the worst thing that ever happened to hip hop, and they're welcome to. But if you listen to a bunch of tracks on that album has more jazz flute stuff sampled than anything I can think of, right? And so it's not so easy to sort of, and it. Because it interrupts people's convenient narratives about the period. But like, one of the things about the historical approach is you actually listen to what, the makers of it had to say. So one of the facts about the low end theory that Q-Tip and Ali have emphasized is like, yeah, we were all listening to we were trying to do the samples of the jazz stuff, but the most important influence on the record was actually listening to NWA Straight Outta Compton. That doesn't fit into people's narrative about how the music was being made, but the myth versus what's actually happening is a kind of weird tension.
And I would say, and what's hilarious is if you're paying attention to like Q-Tip and when he does Vibrant Thing and like right at the end of the 90s, and like it really, you go, this is a departure, but it's actually really, I mean, it feels like P. Diddy is at work. It feels like Puff Daddy is at work or Sean Puffy Combs is at work in Vibrant Thing. And for hip hop heads, there was a moment of like of disorientation in terms of like how we understood the musics, right? So there was like hip hop was the music that was, that had consciousness involved, and rap that's what you did. Like that was pop. And I've never been comfortable with that argument ever because it's so subjective. And it's to suggest like if you're listening to side B of 2 Live Crew, where he is taking to task Miami politics or Floridian politics, where does that fit in if on side 1 is Pop That Pussy? Like, you get what I'm saying? Like, how do we make sense of a rap album that is censored? Really, like the question sometimes becomes when we're looking at hip hop music is it censored because of its spectacular nature around the explicit, or is it constricted because of its political nature as well? And then how do we separate the party from the protest, right? Like there are really unique ways to think about this. And I have always argued that when we see this kind of major takeover of the music industrial complex, so Sony, Columbia, all of those folk, and then Black hands are complicit in kind of these takeovers because they want access to resources, then what you see is a constriction of what is hip hop. Like you get kind of shiny, you get a touch of the hood, a touch of this. It's like a shitty gumbo, if you will. It's like shake in, two shakes of gangster, one shake a gun. I think Lupe Fiasco does a beautiful job of trying to explain what that's like in Daydreaming. In this notion that like around Black bodies are built all of these pathologies that we pay attention to and we actually like, and we buy into this very fetishized understanding of Black hip hop artists.
I'm struggling with that. Even though I did the book, one part when I was writing about hip hop and rap was trying to understand exactly what hip hop is and what rap is. And KRS-One, who I leaned on heavily, because he wrote some really, really heady stuff. And I understood him to say that hip hop was the culture and rap was the language. And is that what you guys see with that, or did I miss or he missed?
I would go with that. But there are other constructions of that argument that hip hop is the music that is conscious and rap is the music that is not conscious.
Yeah. Okay. All right. I got you. And I'm with you. I definitely am not a hip hop head, but I really was. I started off with the early stuff with just after Cool Herc and those guys, stuff that was kind of disco-ish and so forth. And I lost my mind as soon as I heard Sugar Hill. That so I was there, but I was really torn when the shift went from all the conscious stuff, You Must Learn and all that stuff to when. Was it P. Diddy and his partner, Mace? When they came, I thought it was hip or, all about the Benjamins. I was like, wait a minute, we made a serious left turn here right now because it was cool. I just thought the beat was hot, but it was like, wait a minute, we just went from being deep to this here. And, from there, I tried to hang, but, I was waiting for more of what they were teaching. And I said, well, huh?
Diamonds and baguettes, and an amazing and a BMW Lexus.
No, that wasn't happening. But no, it lost me because I thought there was so much great stuff happening with that, and then it seemed to go left with this more commercial. And I do have heartburn with us when we seem to want everything becomes good once a white man legitimizes it. I have a huge problem because no disrespect to people who win Grammys and Emmys and so forth, but that's not my measuring stick. And it seems as though we can get, oh man, they gave us a Grammy, but look at what they gave you a Grammy for. That wasn't the deep stuff that you were spending.
I like Mafia's whoop that trick. Like so.
Exactly. Yeah, it's hard out here for a pimp. You want a Grammy? I'm glad you got the Grammy, but wow,
it's gonna be very like, we're not that far away from hip hop at the Lincoln Center. And but I have a real deep problem, like as do a lot of jazz musicians, about what that meant and what was being included in the repertoire and what was getting left out. That's going to be, but we're not, I'm saying that jokingly, but conceptually, we aren't actually that far from that as a thing. And it's going to be really interesting to see the narratives that people are going to want to make, right? What we're going to want to confer is, which, I've had this conversation with Sean before. Like, I have real concerns with, and it sort of goes back to the question of like, rappers as intellectuals thing. I have real problems where I think basically white listeners have conferred the message as this super important song, and it is. But if you're going to tell me that for 3 years before that, there wasn't a song that contained some kind of message, I'm sorry you weren't getting it explicitly as the message. Like, you needed to have a title called The Message for you to understand that there was something. I mean, that's not on, that's not on the 3 years of rappers from 79 to 82 to like do all work for you. That's your problem as a listener.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a weird thing, right? And so, like, I know when we retroactively, when the cultural makers are going to do that, it's going to be super easy to say the message is the groundbreaking song. It's like, sort of, but like, I'm not quite ready to sort of discount rappers who, and this goes to your question about like what you considered hip hop or rap. Like, for me, it's multi-tiered events. So it is events where it's not just improvising. It is like bebop, like free jazz when they moved into lofts in the 70s, right? Or Mintons with the bebop. Like, you have venues that are specific to you, these kind of weekend venues, and you have multiple practices, not just rapping, and they're happening all together. And that interview, in fact, that the Max Roach thing is so important to me because he does this really curious thing where he's like, it's total theater. And he means like theater in the round kind of thing is what he calls it in 88. And I mean, that's sort of what I think of it as. And so, and I don't think that necessarily all goes away, that improvised spirit thing, the attitude, the bebop thing. I actually just think it shifts into studio spaces. It's not hard to see. So it kind of shifts into, these, one of the things I love about all the sort of our current moment or the last decade is the emergence of books by rappers about their various experiences, autobiography stuff, but also makings of like, it's this spirit of records being made after hours.
And the centrality of the studio.
Members in the studio. In fact, like, there's this great narrative about the making of the De La Soul 3 Feet High album, where they talk about the fact that they can't even tell you how they made the album because there were so many people just walking through all the time and listening, and people saying, I like that, I don't like that, who aren't part of the group, not part of the production, like, they just had people around. And so I think that improvised spirit just shifts. So it's a little harder to sort of be aware of it, but it goes into the studio spaces. And it's not surprising then that studio spaces become these really sacred spaces. Like, the way rappers talk about them is like, they're usually in my basements, or, when they move to home studio, there's this whole sort of thing that happens where the after hours spirit just shifts to studios, and then studios move into homes.
I love that you call it sacred space. It's almost like the studio becomes sanctuary. And even I've read, when I'm reading Rick Ross's book right now, and I'm going back to Gucci Mane's book because I finished it a couple months back. But like, in our trap reading circle, like, you're right. Like, these spaces are seen as home. Everything else, like, it's not the concert venue that is seen as the space of production. What are even, maybe not even production. What I mean, like, artistry. And so I do think you're right about that. I think that's a very powerful analysis of what we see happening. And what would you argue is the equiv for jazz and bebop, Theddy and Alex?
Say that again.
What is the equivalent space?
Well, it depends on the
artist.
I would say, it morphed in time. We got all this technology now, but say at the birth and high point of bebop, I would say the stage. On the stage, you came in and you were given this time to express yourself, whether you were playing for yourself, to your deity, to your girl, whatever. But there was something that happened when all those musicians were in there together, and their spirits and energies and intermingling. I would say that continues even now. But I would say the same thing, that the stage, but also the studio, and you go in and making recordings. This that just popped in my head now. In this age of COVID, when we put people together, I don't know how much of that is lost, or if this energy makes its way a different way, because people will record or do live sessions, but it's actually, let's say, if the four of us were going to do a project, Sean, you record your part, Alice, you record yours, man, you record yours, and I would do mine. And we're all got these specific things that we have to stick to, like the time signature, the tempo and all that, and making sure we're playing tune. And then someone puts them together. And people hear it, and for them, it may have really deep spiritual connection. For us, I think it's different. We're connected, but we weren't in that same room creating that. We're not even in the same space. So that's going to be a little different. But to answer your question, I would say with bebop and jazz, definitely the stage, because you're able to create right there, and studio as well.
There's also a funny time thing with bebop, right? In the sense that, because it's early 40s, and then there's these sort of, because the war is happening, there's the lack of materials to make records. So no one knows it's happening for a moment. So the white sort of imposition on it is slightly delayed. And I think that's actually super important. I mean, can you imagine, it's actually a funny thing to think about, but even right now, if you just told aspiring rappers, you have 4 years where it doesn't matter because no one's looking, do whatever you want. I actually think that'd be what would come out on the 5 years would be wild.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
We are at an hour. This is a great conversation. We're at an hour and want to get y'all out here. There was a couple more questions, then we'll get y'all out. Dr. Porco, you had mentioned when we were discussing questions that you wanted to mention Gordon Parks' A Great Day in Hip Hop photograph.
Yeah.
You have the update of Art Kane's A Great Day in Harlem. So you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, and I just wanted to mention it just because I feel like it's one of those other ways that you can be very particular. I mean, I think about hip hop having, there's hip hop photography. I mean, the last great exhibit I went to was called Contact High, and it was this great sort of exhibit about all the, you saw these contact sheets of the various famous sort of hip hop shoots from decades past. And so the first Jazz Mataz album that Guru does, right? The great thing, you only see his face and cigarette smoke and the microphone, but it's actually at the Village Vanguard, right? That seems super important, so that you can actually create actual real particular connections between sort of history of hip hop and history of jazz. And so the Art Kane thing is just a great example where in '58, Art Kane does his A Great Day in Harlem image, which I think has about 57 jazz performers. And then in 1998, Gordon Parks does his updated version with about 177, I believe is the number 177 rappers. And they do it on the same stoop on 126th Street, except they need 3 stoops for, right? I guess it was originally 17 East 126th. But then they go to 15 and 19, I guess, because they need the extra space. And it's just I think it's an important thing to think about, those particular sort of moments of, there's an example of revising and rewriting something and doing it in an interesting way. And looking at the 2 photos where the sheer volume of people is an interesting thing in the hip hop version. But the other thing is, it was because it became such a social fun event, they couldn't corral everybody. Right? There's a great documentary about how difficult it was to correct. That's essentially what the documentary breaks down to. But because Gordon Parks is trying to get the photo in before the shadow of the sun covers the first row of people, so there's this looming shadow that's coming up over all the performers that's not present in the original Art Kane one. And then in the original Art Kane one, I always love that there's all the jazz performers, but there's a series of kids sitting on the sidewalk. And I always wondered why that. I mean, if they're going to recreate it, it would have been a nice thing. But in the hip hop one, but there may just have been no time, no space, no nothing at that point. But it's just a nice sort of. I like to think of it as these bookends, right? For me, that 1998 photo shoot is pretty much a bookend of a historical period, right? Things changed after that a little bit for me. That might be my limit point on the. I have the same experience. It wasn't Puff Daddy, but it's basically the same thing, right? It's that moment is that I don't go much beyond that. That might be my marker.
I think I continue to be a part of that moment, but I also realize my limitations right now are having to relearn trap music. I can remember early trap because I was in the Atlanta, Georgia, I was in Georgia area. So and now that Southern hip hop has become really a kind of unique, kind of nuanced topic, it's like one of those things like it's really nostalgic for me. So like Arrested Development down to Outkast, because it was also like I was in grad school coming of age in my early 20s when that music hit. So
Excellent.
We are just, I mean, we could go longer, but we gotta, I'm gonna let these gentlemen go. Thank you all so much. If you have any final thoughts you want to leave with the people, any songs that you're like, go check that out. Any final word before we hop off?
I would urge people to check out many of the artists we mentioned, and I'm really digging brother Robert Glasper right now. Incredible artist that is merging a lot of different things. I mean, he's a virtuoso of the piano, but he brings together some really, really interesting artists and is doing some stuff that I think is going to continue to break ground.
I would direct people to, given the jazz thing. So in 1990, 91, and I'm revealing my cultural sort of thing here, but like as a Canadian, in Toronto, there was a duo called the Dream Warriors who have a great track called My Definition of a Boombastic Jazz Style. And they were this great rap duo from Toronto. I hadn't listened to it in so long, but in preparation for this, I listened to it and it's pretty great. They use some Quincy Jones soul bossa nova sample. It's lots of fun. So I direct people to Dream Warriors. It's a pretty funky album.
Cool.
So one major artist, jazz artist that I really appreciate, who's young, who I just think is just doing phenomenal stuff. It's Christian Scott out of New Orleans. And so I tell people to go listen to his horn work any day, like just because what he has done is so much of a remix in time. Like it's like hearing jazz remixed in jazz, which is such a really ridiculous idiom to think about. Like that, that music could do it on its own terms, in its own. It doesn't have to go to another form. And then I actually sat last night and listened to the Baby's album with his newest project, which is called My Brother's Keeper. And it's really a blues set of tracks that is dedicated to his brother passing in convention, who committed suicide recently. And so literally the whole album is really dedicated to the memory of his brother. And I was just struck by its, his pace is fast. So, his pace is super fast. But like, I just think if you're, it is in the tradition of blues and sorrow. I mean, it leans in towards the gospel. And it's very clear that he is missing his family members. And so, his brother. And so like, I think that track is worth lifting up in a moment when so many people are dealing with loss.
All right. So at 1:30, Big B is going to be DJing the set over on Upperman's Instagram. But I just want to thank Dr. Teddy Burgh, Sean Palmer, and Dr. Alice Porco for being a part of this. This was a great discussion. We'll save it on our Facebook so that if y'all want to go back and check it out, and I'll download and send it to all the panelists as well. But thank you all for joining us, and we'll see you.